Oh, yeah.
Can everybody hear me? And I'm going to go this remote. He's going to set me up. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out and watching the presentation. I really enjoy sharing this with audiences. I don't do it that often, but this was a good group. I came to the meeting about a year ago and love the programs and things. I travel quite a bit, so I don't actively get here on a regular basis, but it's amazing the number of speakers and the events that you guys have and support. So it's a great cause. And living here in the South now, you know, in this area with the Revolutionary history and the Civil War history, it's really fascinating. And I'm kind of a casual history buff, but through my work and things at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, I've had a chance to work on many underwater or nautical archaeology projects. Originally born in Dayton, Ohio, the birthplace of aviation, so I try to correct everybody in North Carolina about the Wright brothers. Went to Wright State University, got a nursing degree, but got into diving early on in college. Found that there's a pathway in diving and diving medicine, so because I love to be around the water and diving, use that medical background to kind of work as a medical specialist and things in diving, and was at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington for about 21 years. And when I left, I was a manager of an advanced diving technology program that was heavily funded by NOAA. And as all things, you know, good things must come to an end, but we had some soft money and the program lost some funding. And so we were kind of, you know, put on the street. So I've done other things in consulting and beyond that, but that was, I left the university about 2011. And it's interesting this month to have this talk because my first slide here about 3 days ago, the most famous battle of the first ironclad warships occurred up in Virginia, Hampton Roads, during the American Civil War on March 9th. And the USS Monitor is pictured here. And then depending on where you were born and raised, you either heard about the CSS Virginia if you're in the South, or the Merrimack, which was a Union vessel. And we're going to go through and give you all the background, talk about all this, kind of how we ended up and kind of where we're at today. So it's a pretty fascinating story. And I'm going to see if we can get to the next slide. And let's see. Oop, there we go. I put this picture up. I used to be on the board of the battleship North Carolina for many years on the Friends, and it's a great organization if you like World War II history, and the battleship is really kind of a unique centerpiece here in Wilmington. And of course, if you're a member, you can go on the ship on the 4th of July. It's a great place to see the fireworks. So a little plug for the battleship, and I enjoyed working with those folks. But I picture it because if it hadn't been for the Monitor, our modern day warships might have looked a little different, because the gun turret on the Monitor incorporated was really set the stage for future vessels. So the gun turret can rotate. And so your modern day battleships today, and even the historic ships like the battleship North Carolina, has that technology. So it's kind of an interesting parallel. And I'll just figure out, I haven't used this in a while, so we'll make sure we get it. So my talk is really, can we save the Monitor? You've maybe read Clive Cussler books, Raise the Titanic, and all these other things. And many shipwrecks, you know, it's hard to recover artifacts or recover the ship in its entirety. And I'll just go back for a minute, just give you my background and interest in the ship, if I can. Let's see if I'll go back. They're jumping forward. You want to back up 2 slides for me if you can? There, that's good. Just hold it there for a minute. So I was working at the university in 1990. I got wind that the NOAA researchers that were in Virginia, Newport News, were interested in diving to the Monitor. And there was a group of recreational divers that were using a thing called technical diving for deep water investigation. And NOAA had allowed them some permits, and they would go out with some observers, and they'd allow these wreck divers to dive. When I was at the university, I kind of looked at this technology and thought, well, I think scientists could use the same kind of technology these recreational divers are doing. And so it kind of spawned a project where I went and got trained in this deep water diving techniques, which I'll explain a little bit more in detail. But eventually, we were able to cross-train some NOAA people, and they had a expedition in 1993 to the Monitor. It didn't work out so well, but by 1995, I was actively involved in setting the stage for future expeditions and diving research on the Monitor. And what was interesting, my interest was, I was an underwater photographer, and my interest was really just to take some pictures of the Monitor. But after 12 years, I ended up having to run the civilian side of the program, and finally, I think in the last year, they let me take a camera in the water. But it was kind of interesting, the development, my interest in that. Going backwards again, sorry about that. Well, here, we'll get her figured out. So when you think about the USS Monitor and its development, we have to talk about John Ericsson. He was a Swedish gentleman who migrated, Swedish American, came to the United States and had a concept of putting steam engines on various vessels, railroad cars, railroad trains, ships that would use steam power, moving away from sail-powered vessels to steam-powered. So that was really one of his greatest inventions. He had done some stuff in England before he came to the United States, had a pretty good pedigree and some success, and he was able to, as early as 1826, these are some of his early calculations. And what I saw was interesting when I was doing some research on the Monitor, you can see in the lower right-hand corner, he had these calculations and you know, different angles and different geometry, but in the corner you can see a little vessel in the water with a water line very low to the water line compared to the opposing ship to the left of the slide. And so the Monitor didn't come into play until later in the story, but he was looking at these and designing these things very early on. So a lot of credit goes to John Ericsson as the inventor. Let's see, here we go. So let's kind of go back in time, think about President Lincoln at the White House, the Civil War is erupting. We're getting into the development of kind of how we're going to handle the Civil War. The South is rebelling. They're starting to draw lines across the states and, opposing each other. And one of the things that was very important back in that time is, of course, getting goods and commodities to support the North. The North is very industrialized, the South somewhat limited in their resources. And so there was a lot of activity that was happening in and around the coastal waters and offshore and other countries and other things happening. So Ericsson was able to convince the Ironclad Board in Washington about the development of a battleship that he had conceived, and he called it the Monitor. And so the Department of Navy funded John Ericsson to the tune of about $250,000. And the concept was he would build this vessel, and it was launched on January 30th, 1862. So about, another, 30-some years before, when he had this in his mind, into the development of the ship and its deployment. What was interesting, he delivered this vessel with that price, which was probably, I don't know how it is figured in today's dollars, but it was, quite a sum of money back then. But he delivered it in 90 days, to build a vessel. And what was kind of unique about him being able to put this all together is he used a novel concept where he used multiple foundries. Such a good engineer, and as he designed it, multiple foundries were working on the bits and pieces of the Monitor, and it all came to one point and was assembled. So he probably couldn't have done it in 90 days if he had to rely on one foundry to forge and make the steel cladding and all of that. So this is kind of a birthplace, Greenpoint, Brooklyn, New York, and its initial launch. This animation doesn't show well, it doesn't play well, but if you look at the picture, you can kind of see, and everything you see in books and text, you'll see that the vessel was almost like a submarine in its design, very low to the water, about 18 inches of freeboard, and the idea was, to help protect some of the lower hull and things like that. So kind of novel in that situation. There were a lot of, on the Monitor when it was constructed, you go back and look at some of the technology, there's probably about 50 different patentable items on the Monitor. So he used all of his brain power, all of his engineering skills to be very, very innovative. Things like under the waterline flushing toilets and the steam engine and how the four-bladed propeller and the gears and things. So there was a lot of invention, as well as the revolving gun turret, which housed two 12-inch Dahlgren guns. And this is a photograph. Unfortunately, Lincoln wasn't in it. He didn't get to the party in time, and he missed the photo op. But this was the officers on the Monitor in front of the turret. It kind of gives you an idea of the scale and size. The weight about 120 tons, about 8 plates of steel riveted together. When they were not in battle, it had a kind of a sunshade, and the crew would operate. We'll get more into the internal aspect of this. But ironically, Erickson, as proud as he was of the vessel, the turret was like kind of not something was kind of a novelty. He didn't even try to get a patent for it because there were other people that had developed the gun turret, but they were land-based. But he incorporated that onto a ship, and that's what kind of made this vessel so unique. So about 3 days ago was the anniversary of the March 9th battle, where in Hampton Roads, the Monitor was dispatched for the Union to go in and protect some ships that were in Hampton Roads. And they were there to help to defend those. Some of those were damaged and sunk because this new creation that and the history behind this CSS Virginia occurred. The Merrimack was abandoned by the Union forces. They tried to burn it, and it sank. And the soldiers from the Confederacy came in and were able to raise the hull, and they built their own ironclad. And they placed their guns along the sides and forward and aft. And basically it's steam powered again. And they were using that, and that was going to be their tool to fight against the Union. And it came into Hampton Roads and started to destroy some of the blockades and some of the vessels, the wooden sailing vessels that were either aground or couldn't maneuver. And they were really, dead birds because they were very limited what they could do with the power of the CSS Virginia. The Monitor steamed in, they clashed, they fought for about 4 hours, they each took shot. The captain at the time, the Monitor, was injured. They had to relieve command, and eventually, after about 4 hours, and there were people picnicking on the shoreline, watching this event like a football game. But eventually the ships moved away. It was kind of a draw. Nobody won, nobody lost. They lost a few Union vessels, but the Monitor was able to save a majority of those vessels in Hampton Roads that day. So for them, it was kind of determined that it was a victory. And this is post-battle, and you can see this is the turret side with the two ports for the gun turrets. And the officers there on the deck. You can see how close it is to the water. Again, it's very shallow, 18 inches up. We're looking kind of forward. There's a pilot house in the front, and the anchor well was in the front. But you can see on the turret itself where it took shot from the CSS Virginia has the dents and things like that. So it did survive and was a pretty good tool for coastal aggression and defense. And again, just there's a lot of history behind it, and a lot of artwork done and things to kind of depict this famous battle. But it kind of gives you a good graphic representation of what the Monitor was set out to do, is to protect the Navy ships. And this one's called the Merrimack, but of course the CSS Virginia with the Southern folks. And it was a little disadvantage because the CSS Virginia had to turn, where the Monitor, because of that unique gun turret, could rotate slowly, but it could rotate, didn't have to change the course of the vessel. So very, very innovative. And in March of 2012, they celebrated the 150th anniversary of the battle, and goes on and on. So the story goes, the Monitor regrouped, was moved around quite a bit, had some other engineering stuff added to it. But unfortunately, it was really designed as a coastal vessel in the marshes and in the intercoastal waterway and things like that. Never was designed to be offshore. But they decided to move it south, move it down to Beaufort, North Carolina. And it was under tow by the USS Rhode Island. And off of Cape Hatteras during Christmas Eve, it encountered a gale force storm. And again, the ship not having adequate, being really seaworthy, floundered, took on water, and eventually sank on New Year's Eve day. And this artist kind of depicts under tow. It was getting dark. There was some signal lamps. They tried to launch some lifeboats. The crew was getting off. The Monitor was about 173 feet long, about 40 feet wide. Most of its workings were below deck. A lot of the staterooms and the galleys, everything were very, very finely appointed because this was John Ericsson's baby. This was his Cadillac. This is what he wanted to sell. He wanted more contracts from the Navy. So it was really outfitted nicely. But in any event, under tow, it couldn't take the seas, and about a crew of about 58 were on board, and 16 were able to evacuate. Well, I'm sorry, they evacuated from the Rhode Island lifeboats, but 16 sailors were lost during this event, and that occurred on New Year's Eve in 1862. So it had a very, very short lifespan. Position-wise, unknown where it ended up on the seafloor, but if we look at a map, and this is the graveyard of the Atlantic, and if we look, this points here, my pointer here. So we're here, this is Cape Hatteras, this is Ocracoke, and you come out Cape Hatteras Inlet, and so about 16.5 miles offshore was where the Monitor was finally located. And of course, the Graveyard Atlantic has a lot of other vessels. Of course, Blackbeard played up in here, World War I, World War II, a lot of German U-boats and things like that. But this is a blow up of the North Carolina area. So that's kind of where it sits today, in situ. It wasn't until about 1973 that some scientists from Duke University with some remote sensing equipment wanted to do a serious search in the 70s to see if they could find it and look at it. And so they towed instruments and things like that and found this sonar image and identified it. And what was challenging for investigation is that the Monitor had the turret 120 tons on top of its deck, but when it floundered and sank, it capsized and the turret fell off because this is held by gravity, and then the ship came down on top of it. So it almost looks like a U-boat. So they were thinking during World War I and World War II, there's evidence to suggest that maybe as the Navy was sonaring, they may have thought it was a German U-boat, dropped some depth charges and things like that. That might have created some additional damage. But unbeknownst to them, it was actually the Monitor laying on the bottom. So that was a pretty significant find for this ship. Come on, baby. In 1975, NOAA, Department of Commerce, us taxpayers, they designated this as the very first national marine sanctuary in the country. The Monitor sank in about 240 feet of water. It sits in a position in the Gulf Stream, between the Gulf Stream and the Labrador currents offshore, 16 miles offshore. And it's upside down, and this is kind of a bow picture of it. And essentially, became an artificial reef for North Carolina. And it wasn't until later in I think it was 1977, that there was an expedition that brought a submersible out, and they were actually able to dive and observe, and they had a lockout capability. So that diving team in the 70s able to lock out of the submarine. They recovered the anchor, and they recovered the signaling light that was used during the distress call. So those are some significant finds that they had. So this kind of shows you in situ, when I first arrived and did some diving there, what we were working with. And we're looking at the stern of the vessel. You can see a shaft there that goes back to a propeller, a lot of incrustation. The engine area under the lower hull is covered up, and you can see the turret, which is inverted and upside down, sitting in the sand, kind of a resting place for the hull. And this was the signal lamp that was used for distress that was found out on the seafloor. It was recovered and conserved. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting is I'm sorry, I'm really, Go ahead and go back one slide for me. I'm not sure if that mouse is affecting anything. There we go. So this is the anchor that was recovered as well. So that fell out of the anchor well. They didn't try to anchor. It just came out and was laying next to the ship. So that was kind of a nice recovery. Went up to the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. And the Monitor that was talking about, John was talking about it earlier, is a very good maritime museum, but it was also the host museum for the Monitor collection. So they became the official museum in Virginia to get the remnants of anything recovered from the Monitor. And as the story will go on, you'll see some more things that they were able to do with some of the other pieces that were recovered. So 1862, she officially sank. 1984, some submarine activity. But by 1990, when I first got involved, they noticed that the ship was really deteriorating rapidly. And so there was a high level of interest in getting on the ship. We knew we couldn't recover the entire ship, but we knew that there were some significant pieces and artifacts that we should examine and look at closer. This kind of looks at some of the ship, some of the bones of the ship, where some of the steel planks have fallen off. You can see some of the marine growth, some of the fish and things. So when you visit it on a dive, this is kind of what you're seeing and looking at. And sometimes hard to distinguish where you're at and what the components are just because of the marine growth. Looking at it kind of on a kind of horizontal view, artificial reef, a lot of fish activity and things. But what happens in this area, because where it sank, with the Gulf Stream going north and the Labradors coming down, this current eddies back and forth, and there's a lot of turbulence and things. So a lot of deterioration is just from oceanographic conditions and things. But slowly, gravity took its toll. Pieces of the hull collapsed. Everything got covered up, and so. But teams would go down and we'd do spot excavations and things like that to look for artifacts. So we go fast forward a little bit, 1995, but by 1998, the Monitor had a plan to go out and save the most significant artifacts. And fortunately, at that time, the U.S. Navy came forward with the Department of Defense, and they had the Legacy Fund, which was a separate fund from the Navy Ops that enabled Navy personnel, Navy operations to get this kind of extramural funding to help maintain their readiness. And so the deep sea divers for the Navy were very interested in getting this funding and then partnering with NOAA to go out and help with some of the extra help. And this kind of shows in this Time magazine piece about some of the things that were going to be done, and they were going to be done in a sequence of things, but a significant amount of money, $22 million over the course of 6 or 7 years to allow Navy ships, Navy divers, and things to come out. And our team, working with NOAA and the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, we were the civilian side of that, and we were using different types of diving technology, but we partnered and did a lot of things with the Navy. But just briefly, you can see the side of the Monitor off of Cape Hatteras. And then the idea of this vessel was to do a couple different things. They first started with the removal of the propeller and the shaft. Then they wanted to support the hull by grouting underneath where the turret was, and then removing the lower hull to access the steam engine, get the steam engine out, then remove the iron belt around the Monitor and access the turret, and then go down and recover the turret. So kind of in that phased approach, stabilize things and then take the artifacts that they could. So we had, that just kind of depicts the ROV and the bell diving that the Navy was doing. Oops, sorry. Go back one up for me. Yeah, that's fine. That's, again, showing you kind of where we were at in the sand on the bottom, 240, 230 feet of seawater. You see the rudder in the back, and it's sitting on top of the turret. And what I didn't understand until I went down to Columbus, Georgia, to the Naval Civil War Museum, is how you would get 58 men on this vessel, 173 feet long, 40 feet wide. It just kind of dawned on me because when I'd see it on the bottom, I just couldn't visualize it. But I went to, you back me up again. So they have, and then you may have been up to Newbern and seen the vessel up there, the ironclad in the museum. A lot of times they recover the timbers from the riverbeds or the seafloor. But when you encase the vessel with the hull and what would have been the ironclad portion, you can kind of see, get a really different perspective of these vessels and how roomy they were under the waterline and how they were built. So that helped me quite a bit in terms of understanding how the Monitor kind of was laid out and how you could, support the sailors and the operations of it. So the Navy came in, Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit number 2 out of Little Creek, Virginia. They were very gung-ho about their task. There's a little model of the Monitor. They're talking about how they're going to rig and recover that 4-bladed propeller. And Master Chief, Superintendent of Diving's there, Chris Murray. And so this is their kind of salvage plan. And they, go ahead, you have a question?
What's the draft of the ship below the waterline?
It's about, good question, about 40 to 45 feet, so below the waterline. So the Navy came in using mixed gas diving techniques, hard hat diving. They would deploy 2 divers, and they had a standby diver. And this was done on a vessel that was placed in a 4-point moor above the Monitor. And they were to go down and do follow the archaeologist's instructions, but investigate, film, recover what they could. Pretty big operation, big footprint. They'd go on a stage, they'd go in the water. Some days, because of the currents, it made it very difficult for them to dive because they're going down on the stage. Their umbilicals are going over the side. They're flapping in the breeze because of currents and things. But they had communications, lights, and could talk to topside. And their task was to get to the bottom, get off their stage. And for this particular year, they were going to use a reciprocating hydraulic saw, and the idea was to cut through the shaft of the propeller and the propeller shaft, rig the propeller, and then bring that artifact to the surface. So they assembled that, got it in, the saw would cut through this wrought iron, and eventually freed the propeller and shaft from the vessel itself. So this is kind of a picture of them working on the bottom. They were doing diving, which is called surface supply diving with SUR-DO2. So on this particular expedition, they had a limited bottom time, 20 to 30 minutes to work. Then that basket was brought up, and then those divers had to undress and go in a chamber on the deck and finish decompression on the deck. And that would free it up for the next diver. So they were kind of diving in and out, but they had some decompression obligations. So it's called bounce diving or surface applied diving. So that was one of the techniques that they were trying to improve upon and learn about through the Navy funding. They took video and reserves and were in communication with the archaeologists and things, so very, very well controlled. This is where the shaft and the propeller is rigged for lifting, so once it was cut free, it was brought to the surface. And this is when it reached the surface on June 5th, 1998. And what was kind of surprising as it came up, one of the things we didn't realize is that 2 of the blades were actually fractured. And probably during its coastal activity, it may have ran aground or something, but it was kind of, we didn't expect that to see that the 2 of the 4 blades was damaged. It was set in a cradle, taken back up to Newport News, and then they established some holding tanks to start the conservation. So whenever you take metal, ferrous metal out of the sea, you have to go through a process of electrolysis. You have to remove the salts and things out of the material, and it may take up to 20 years. Classic examples of that, of course, the Hunley down in Charleston. So just because you get Blackbeard's cannon or the propeller from the Monitor, that the work's not done, and the expense is not done because it has to go to a conservation lab. But the Navy was quite proud of their effort, and that led to more opportunities for them to come back out. So this is the stuff that, as it gets removed, goes up. So the propeller then went into a conservation bath. And what happens, they run electric currents through that to desaltificate the metal, because if it's allowed to sit in the sun and dry out, the salts crystallize, the metal flakes, and eventually turns to dust. So if you don't do the process of electrolysis, you're removing some of the ions with some metallurgical tasks to kind of desalt those materials so that they can then be conserved and placed on display. And that was when it was finished and put in the museum, and you can see where, now it's conditioned and it's in stable condition and can be put on display, but it's probably about a 10-year process for the propeller. Oh, that was another picture of it. Let's see what comes up next here. The efforts of that recovery was interesting. I had a colleague that was in filmmaking. I told him about the expedition, and so a team came out and filmed us recovering that propeller, and it premiered on Nova, and that year it was their season premiere. It's called Lincoln's Secret Weapon, and you can find this in DVD, and you might be able to find it on YouTube, but it talks about the battle, talks about our efforts. It's kind of interesting to see the diving, kind of in real time, but that's available. My side of the coin was from the civilian side, was when we dove with the Navy in concert from the bigger platform, but when the Navy left, then our team went out on a smaller footprint on a day operation out of Cape Hatteras. We used the Cape Fear, which was parked down here at UNCW, 65-foot old wreckfish boat that was converted with some berthing and things. So we would pilot that out, take the 2-hour boat ride offshore, and we would field a team of about 12 to 16 scuba divers that were using, and this is a picture of me using mixed gas technology for the deeper diving, and then carrying oxygen and another mix called nitrox to allow me to help decompress, because at 240 feet with about 25 minutes of bottom time on this gas mixture, I'd have to decompress for about 60 to 70 minutes in the water column. So I have to carry twin tanks on my back to support the time. And then as they come up through the water column, I would use different gases to help expedite the elimination of inert gas, which is a problem, nitrogen predominantly, and then in this case, helium, because our gas mix was 18% oxygen, 50% helium, 32% nitrogen. So what we did is we reduced the oxygen because of oxygen toxicity. We reduced the nitrogen because of nitrogen narcosis, and we added helium because it's a fast gas, like a balloon helium gas. It's very light, it goes in the body 4 times faster, comes out 4 times faster. But that combination was like what we call the best mix for the diving, and that enabled us to have good, safe profiles, provided we did the in-water stops and the decompression. But for a summer, at about 120 bottles of this, it was about a $10,000 gas bill. And in open circuit scuba, it just gets bubbled away in the water column, but it's the only way you can get there. So our divers would set up, and we'd go out to the site. We knew the numbers and the position and things. Sometimes we had to fudge it a little bit because we had current issues to deal with. We wanted to be dropped, and by the time we got to the bottom, we wanted to land on the wreck itself. And we'd field about 12 divers at a time, teams of 2, and they would go down and have different tasks. We'd go down together as a group, do our work, get together, then surface and do our decompression. This is one of the static lines we had as a guide if we needed it. This is kind of how we had to commute down. A little different than the Navy technique of the surface supplied type diving. This is a picture of one of the self-contained divers. This is up on the bow, ship's upside down. You can see a little bit of corner of where the anchor well was, a real round area on the bow. Really a lot of marine crustaceans and marine growth on the vessel. This made the cover of a Sea History magazine, talked about the recovery efforts. This is another in situ picture of the diver kind of working around, kind of gives you a little bit of scale of the vessel. The bow end upside down, the anchor well, and then most of the lower hull now is gone, the lower portion of that, of the vessel.
On a good day, how much visibility?
Visibility could vary from 0 to, you could see it almost from the surface, believe it or not. It depended on the currents and it depended on the Labrador, and there was no rhyme or reason. The nice thing was, as we approached the wreck, even in low visibility conditions, the amberjacks would kind of lead us to the wreck because of the fish population. And so this is the team kind of maneuvering around the wreck. And you can see the armor belt up around the side, upside down, and its reinforcements. But then a lot of the lower hull structure and things like the galley, the berthing, the officers' quarters, the kitchen, all that stuff, a lot of that superstructure had collapsed and is laying on top of the vessel. It makes it difficult to do any sort of excavation. And these are my buddies, the amberjacks. So when you'd approach the wreck, even on low condition, they would kind of help lead you. If you saw them, that was a good sign. And they could bring you in because they just were there feeding, and that was their home. So the archaeologists would do a lot of investigation and in detail. The Navy was there for the heavy lift. Our stuff was much more simple, looking at various features, mapping and drawing, and helping provide data back for recovery purposes. This is a kind of a neat little artifact. It's probably still down there. It was attached to some of the iron, but it's a skylight. So one of the innovations that Erickson had was to get light into the lower quarters without having to burn kerosene or lamps or things. These were portholes like you'd find on a ship, but they were on the deck, and they could be open for ventilation and closed, but it allowed ambient light to come in. And a lot of the sailors, in one of the books I brought, the Monitor Chronicles, there's some letters in there. It talks about from the crew. It's kind of an interesting book, and it's available at Amazon, but talks about even the sailors, because of the low water line, they would see fish and things go over the lights. But that was one of the skylights, which is kind of a unique artifact, kind of in situ. The tools, we used some crowbars and hammers and stuff. And in this picture, we were working in an area that was the galley, and these were some cupboards. And we discovered something white. It looked like an oyster shell, but with further examination, it turned out to be a water pitcher, which we were able to recover intact. And I'll show that in a minute. But then you dive for about 20, 25 minutes. You're watching your gases. Then we start our ascent, and we do some deep water stops, and then we kind of move up in the water column, stopping at 50, then 40, then 30 feet. And at 20 feet, we switch to pure oxygen, spend another 20 to 30 minutes, and we surface. But in a lot of cases, when we were dropped on the wreck, we were 2 miles up the coast because of the Gulf Stream. But because we were free drifting, we didn't have the umbilicals, as a group, we'd stay together. We had emergency gases. We had support divers coming down, monitoring us. So we just kind of drift along and casually do our in-water decompression stops. So, a little bit of work, and then we have to decompress. Sometimes you'd be visited by a little oceanographic creature, come up, check you out. And for Fred, that's Steve in the picture. Take that, get a screenshot. Fred went to high school with Steve Sellers. He was the ECU, a diving officer, and he came out. And, we worked together quite a bit. They were the nautical group out of East Carolina University. So we partner with a lot of people, and that was that water pitcher. So occasionally you'd find things disturbed, and you could go down and investigate. And then if it was worth, if the archaeologists approved it, we would try to recover it, bring it back, and take it back to the museum, and it'd go through conservation and be put on. But we were working in the galley at that time, and that was one of the kind of the finds. We're getting back to John Erickson. I mean, he had all these patented ideas, and it was really revolutionary, the design of the vessel. It was the first of its kind, and then after that, many monitors were built. I don't know what kind of royalties he received or not, but it wasn't so much the gun turret and the revolving turret, but it was the steam engine, reciprocating steam engine, which he had that was really his claim to fame on locomotives and on other vessels. And this is kind of a drawing of that, and kind of how it worked. And of course, there was a boiler, coal-fired, steam pressure. reciprocating, vibrating engine, so back and forth, and it would turn the propeller. This is kind of a model. It doesn't play, but it shows the condenser. It shows this, and the engine itself and how it would be tied into the Monitor's four-bladed propeller. So this engine would work itself back and forth and turn that. One key feature on that engine, and we had to get the engine before we could go for the turret, was this reversing wheel on the front. It looks like a steering wheel. But if they wanted the ship to go forward, they'd crank that and it would power forward. And if they needed to reverse, they'd crank it back and would turn the screw. So it was a reversing wheel. So that was, all in on the wreck, kind of see how it was placed there. Now this will play, fortunately. I don't know why the other ones wouldn't, but this is looking at the engine room, looking at this condensing unit, looking at the reversing wheel. And we're inside the hull of the ship in the engine room, and then we're looking and trying to identify with flagging tape where the cuts can be made, where they could get the structure and lift this engine and decking out of the lower hull. So it kind of sees how you're working there. Light's somewhat limited. You got a lot of fish life. The marine growth is so intense that it's really hard to see, what you're looking at. But there are things that will come up in this video that you can really identify and say, so we're coming up closer and closer, and then eventually you're going to see the reversing wheel, which is very prominent. It was made from brass, so it was very stable there. There's a lot of girders and other support members and things like that. Some of the stuff failed and it collapsed. There's a sea anemone on the sea floor and the sand. But we're looking at the ship, again, upside down. That adds a little bit of confusion. So we're poking around in there, trying to get a good video for the, and it's a tight space because you're inside the lower hull, and things are getting hung up, your tanks and your regulators, but there's the reversing wheel that you saw, the brass reversing wheel. And just kind of continuing to look around and poke around and what would happen is that and then down below are a couple of the gauges for, and they're revolution meters like your speedometer. So they would count the number of cycles of the propeller. So they were kind of, again, Ericsson's design and things to look at the power, looking at the number of rotations and kind of like a maintenance design, I guess. And those were brass. A lot of sponges, a lot of incrustations, oyster toadfish. All sorts of critters in there, just living large. So that's kind of what it looks like, in situ, and that's when it comes out of the water. It's all encrusted like that, and then the job is for the conservators at that point. So this will finish here in just a minute. And of course, you're trying to be calm and still, but again, the bottom time clock's running, you're checking your gas supplies, time pressure, you got to get the work done, but you got to be safe about it. So a lot of things going on to kind of get these dives accomplished.
Doug, say again, what was the limit of how long you could stay down there at a time?
25 minutes was what yeah. And then the longer we stayed, the more penalty we have in the water column. So we had to balance what we were carrying with us to make sure we could get out of the water. If we stayed longer, we had other backups and standby. There's actually a stairwell coming down in. Remember, we're upside down, but that's a stairwell coming into the engine room. So,
how many times did you go down?
Just once a day.
How many days?
We would go out for 2-3 weeks, and we'd dive pretty much regularly every day, maybe take a day off for rest, but you could dive once a day. Say again?
Any of the famous squalls come up?
Yeah, there were days we had weather days, and there were days we got our butt kicked going out and coming in. Yeah. It's challenging. What was worse is when those two currents would, that's when things really got. Some days would be flat, calm, beautiful, and we'd drop in and the current would be humping. Then days we'd get out there and we'd be rocking and rolling, 3 to 5 foot seas. We'd be able to get the team off. There'd be no current. So go figure, you know, the good days topside were bad on the vice versa. So it's kind of, sorry. Go back one slide. There you can you go back one, go back, I think, go up one more. Okay, perfect, thank you. So you can see the Navy stage on the bottom. You can see the area of question, the engine room, and you can see the turret upside down. So the next field season for the Navy was to come out and place this bridge over the wreck. And the bridge idea was lifted down, and it had what they call an ERS, engine recovery structure, which allowed them to attach to the engine, pick the engine up, secure it to the bridge. The bridge then was lifted out of the water. And so over the course of quite a few weeks, this engineering was done, and there were measurements taken. There was some cleaning done. This area was kind of freed up from the ship itself. I'll just kind of run through these quickly. The next one. There's a reversing wheel with all the marine growth on it. And this kind of shows you a graphic of how that lower hull was removed and the engine was recovered and rigged. And then a 300-foot, 500-ton lifting capacity crane barge, the Wotan, was on deck. This is what the Navy used for their diving platform. And this is what was able to bring up the bridge. Now, one of the things in this operation to do that work, and because of the amount of time needed on bottom, the Navy switched to what they call a saturation diving. And if you saw the movie Last Breath, you kind of understand a little bit how commercial divers or Navy divers, they live in a chamber on the vessel, they saturate to a couple hundred feet, and they live there. And then when they want to go diving, they go, and the bell connects to the habitat on the deck. They transfer to the bell's lowered over the ship. 3 divers go down, 2 go out, work, safety diver inside. They can work up to 6 hours. They come back to the bell's brought up, they transfer back in, another 2, 3 guys go in the bell. So 24-hour-a-day operations. These guys live there like for 30 days, and they go in and out, and work every day. But as long as you're saturated, you don't have to do all that decompression until the very end of the mission. So this is a saturation diving bell that the Navy used, and again, part of the funding was to help support them to stay current in this kind of diving technology. And this is what it looked like underwater. And of course, there were other partners. There was a commercial diving company and some engineering companies that helped partner with the Navy to kind of help guide them. This is one of the Navy divers there cutting away some of the hull, working on getting that engine free. This is the bridge structure underneath. This made for a nice dive because if we couldn't see the ship, we'd usually run into the bar, the bridge, and then we could find our way to the wreck in low visibility. And that's kind of how it was positioned over the wreck. But this was essential for us to get to the turret. This is where it's being lifted out of the water. This is where it reaches in 2001, where it reached the surface. You see the complexity of the diving operation in the background compared to our little 65-foot research vessel. But a lot of money. And then lifted onto a barge and then taken up to the Mariners Museum, and it underwent conservation. And that vessel's in a 4-point moor over the Monitor and roughly 230 feet of water. And off she goes. So that's kind of what it looked like up close. It's upside down. Got up to the Monitor that was put in a conservation bath, and it's still undergoing conservation as we speak. A lot of components, a lot of vessels and crystals. That's the condenser. This part of makes the steam and things to help power the reversing engines. That's the marine growth on it. You can see those odometers. A lot of critters fall off and ooze out, and that has to be cleaned and investigated. But eventually, once it's cleaned and goes through conservation, brass and things, you start seeing, what you've recovered, and that it takes a while. The biggest expense, you talk about $22 million for the operation for diving, and probably another $22 million just in conservation, because there's a lot of expense. These are the baths that they're put in with the electrolysis. This is part of the shaft undergoing conservation. And so we'll get to the turret. That's why you all came for, understand the turret and the turret recovery. But we had to do this in stages. And if you're to go to Newport News, go to the Mariners Museum, you can actually go through a visitor viewing area to see these things in conservation. They actually have a mock-up of the Monitor that you can walk on outside, and then they have recreations of the turret and different things, aspects of the corridors and things of the Monitor. It's really a great museum to visit. But I have a blueprint over here and shows you some of the drawings. So on your way out, you might want to check on that closer. It's got some of Ericsson's designs and some of the placement of things just to give you an idea. But the turret had two 12-inch Dahlgren guns, and they were on gun carriages. And you can see the mechanism where the turret could rotate 360 degrees. That was steam powered, another patentable invention by Ericsson. The guns could be loaded and moved in and out of position, and the turret would rotate. And again, it was all held on by gravity. So when the boat capsized, that turret fell off, went down, and then the ship came down on top of it. It wasn't a real great duty station. This is kind of what it looked like when you were inside. Massive guns, 12-inch, and you can see kind of the cradle or the tray where the guns could swivel, and as the turret moved around, they could, position these and use these gun ports and repel, the enemy fire and things. But that was the biggest innovation. Though he didn't patent the turret because it was already existed, but his application of the turret on a vessel was and if you go to the Mariners Museum, you can actually see cutaways and kind of get an idea and walk around, see the scale of that turret, which is kind of interesting. And eventually that turret will be on display. It'll be fully conserved. So our next challenge was a turret. It was like an upside down cup. It filled with sand. The lower hull was resting on top of it. So what do you do? How do you get to that turret? So that's another job for the Navy. Yeah, let's get her going here. You can see where it's pinched and it's pushed down in the sand. And this is kind of looking at it underneath. I'll go to the next slide. I'm not sure if there we go. So our team went in and we used some ground penetrating radar. It was designed for underwater applications. So you may have seen people walking, looking for power lines or tile or whatever in the ground, or artifacts on a battlefield or something. So we employed this on the turret to see. Well, the big question was, are the guns still in it, or do they fall out when it capsized? So that was one of the early questions. How much weight and how do we accommodate for the recovery? So that's kind of what we did. The Navy came in, they started excavating, pulling the sand out of the turret to see what could identify anything, and sure enough, they dug down deep enough and they found the carriage wheels for the gun carriages. So, and a lot of marine growth, a lot of coral, a lot of other stuff. So before the lift, a lot of that had to be excavated out to free up some weight. The lower hull had to be cut away, so the saturation divers used hydroblasting, and they cut through the steel, they cut through the wood, and they removed that to free up an area where they could get to the turret. So a lot of work in preparation of the recovery. A lot of that material was carried off, a lot of it was documented. It was mostly salvage stuff. There was nothing really there of any value other than wood and steel, but we tried to account for what we could. It's still part of the Monitor, still in situ there on the bottom, but that's what was removed to get to that was one of our jobs. Then the Navy came in with a thing called the Spider. They had engineered a device that had 8 legs, and once the turret was excavated, we could place this Spider, then hydraulically clamp it to the 120-ton turret, and when it was clamped in and secured, then they would lift the Spider and the turret and bring it to the surface. And you can see one of my divers down there doing some video. We were looking at, is it the Navy? Everybody's really concerned about getting it correctly mounted, and is it secure, inside and out as well. And this is one of the legs. This is of the 8. Kind of went down in the sand, went under the turret, kind of clamped on like one of those claws that you find in a gaming room. And then the two Dahlgren guns, which were identified as they were excavating down, those were rigged and structurally put in the rigged to the turret itself for stability. And we would go in and take our video cameras. We were able to, because we were a little bit freer because we didn't have umbilicals, and we could go in and maneuver. And actually, I was in the turret a few times, videotaping the rigging and things. But what was kind of an all-stop situation that occurred is that when they were excavating the turret, they found the remains of 2 sailors. And that's where, of the 16 that perished, the 2 were trapped in the turret, and their skeletons were there as we excavated. So had to kind of rethink that. That was kind of unexpected. So those remains were removed, and then they were shipped to Hawaii because the Army has a special forensic POW, MIA type lab, and they can take human remains from the battlefield, and then they can kind of do some analysis with the potential of maybe finding out who the sailors were. So that's where they went, but it was interesting to learn about that. So we were in position just waiting for a good weather day because it had to be really calm. It'd be like a wrecking ball bringing that turret up. Similar barge that was on site. And then the next year, 2002, about 5 in the afternoon, the turret in this spider was raised, and you've probably seen pictures and seen this, to everybody's success. And let's see what else we got here. So that was loaded onto the vessel, transported back to the Mariners Museum, and then this is with other funding and grants and private donations, and they built this large conservation area to start handling a lot of this material, because that's where the work really begins. The fun part is the diving and the expedition, but there's a lot of work by the conservators. Go back one for me, I'm sorry. Okay, go forward, I guess. Yeah. So occasionally they would drain the tank. This is where the turret is. It had been completely excavated. Once it got back to the Mariners Museum, the cannons were still in there as material, so they took some time to do like a ground type dry, excavation. But they cleared everything out, and they kept it wet so it wouldn't deteriorate. And then this tank would be filled to the brim, and electrolysis would be applied. And then occasionally they'd have to change the water. Once you're doing that, the water has to be changed frequently because you get all those minerals and salts. So you flush and then reintroduce water, and it's kind of a process that goes on and on and on. But you can see all this going on when you visit the. Yeah. Inside there, which was interesting, we found besides the human remains, we found their personal effects: coat, boots, even a wedding ring. So unfortunately, the things that we found, or the conservators found, there was nothing we could identify to the crew. Not as cool as Dixon's coin that was in the Hunley, where he was shot in Shiloh in the battlefield. So you'd hope there was like an engraving or someone's name or something, but unfortunately that didn't give us any clues. And again, these all go through their own leather and preservation and things like that. This was the coat and some of the other artifacts and things that were inside the turret at the time of the sinking. It was alleged there was a cat put in the Dahlgren gun and to save the ship's cat. We didn't find any cats in the turret. Guns, the Dahlgren gun. So this was, not only did they, take the remains and analyze, look for DNA matches. Louisiana State did some, with the skulls, did some facial recognition. So they looked at the models and they kind of determined these are what the 2 sailors looked like. Is it kind of I don't know how much AI they used, but they were able to kind of, based on the features and things. But again, no identification, nobody family of those, nothing, no DNA match, no identification. So they're kind of, still kind of unknown. But the good news was that in Arlington, there was a monument made for the Monitor, and these are the 16 crewmen. And it was there as a monument, but now the Navy did, with full military honors, interned the 2 sailors in Arlington. So if you visit Arlington, we don't know who those 2 were, but the crew that was lost is featured there, and these sailors were buried there with military honor. Kind of cool. That was in 2013 when they finally made it home. Sorry. And this is kind of, it wasn't just me out there. This was kind of our crew. This is our vessels in the background, but seasonally we'd invite a lot of different participating divers and universities to come and participate. And Fred, I don't know if you can pick Steve out of there or not. The color should he's in ECU purple, just behind me. But we had a lot of divers, a lot of support people, boat captains and things, and so we day trip out of Hatteras. So this was kind of our scientific team for that season. A lot of good memories, a lot of good camaraderie. Really safe mission. We really didn't have any diving incidents or anything like that. So really fun project to be involved in. This was featured in one of the books here. Two books I brought. One is the Monitor Chronicles, which is about letters that they assembled from crew and officers that writing home, talking about their experience on the Monitor. And it features a chapter on our recovery. And then the USS Monitor, which is going to be a raffle prize, was written by John Broadwater, Dr. John Broadwater, PhD. He was the director of the Monitor program. He was my boss when we were working with NOAA. And his kind of, swan song was to write that book and basically the history of the Monitor and then all the different phases. So from an operational standpoint, again, you can get that on Amazon, but it features our group as well and the NOAA university work as well as the Navy and talks about everything. But the surgeon for the Monitor wrote this, lost treasure in the ocean. And kind of the point here is that, it's history, but we hope that continue to remember about the Monitor and teach about the Monitor and learn about, its trials and tribulations for, generation after generation. And finally, just another glory shot of us kind of in the water. And then just from a participant standpoint, you can kind of see the cast of characters. Besides the Monitor, the Navy and UNCW and ECU, Oceaneering Engineering, Phoenix International. We had a lot of different universities. We had a lot of different Navy vessels, Harbor Branch, NOAA diving. The list goes on and on. So it's really a multifaceted effort to pull all this together. And then special thanks, of course, to the Navy and to my colleagues and NOVA and the filming and John Broadwater and his work. It's been featured on a lot of different programs with the CBS Sunday Morning History Channel and things. And there's a really good link. I'll see when we take a break, I'll try to get it up on the screen. There's a good site at the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary NOAA site on the web. It comes out on Facebook, but they've been going out since we've done a lot of the recovery and still are documenting things. And there's some good video of a rendering of how the ship handled itself and what happened during the sinking, and there's some not ROV, but some side scan sonar and some other things, and some video cameras. There's a model where you can do a 360 and look at the in situ how it is today with the artifacts gone. I think that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'll answer any questions, a few questions you have. Wasn't too bad. Yeah.
As I was listening to all this, I'm amazed at the amount of resources and money that went into this recovery. Is that way above what usually happens?
It's kind of unprecedented because, as you know, federal budgets and things, they shrink. They're not a lot. From the civilian side and our side, it was the
government is doing this.
We were able to bring in personnel, which is a big thing. And so when these host universities like ECU, maybe University of Miami, things, my colleagues are chomping at the bit to have a venture and to dive and do that. So they were able to, pony up, and they didn't pay support or funding, but the fact that they could travel and subsist and dive and come in, complemented the crew. From the NOAA standpoint, they had research dollars that were appropriated by Congress every year, but they were, to get offshore and to do the things we were doing. So the Navy, that $222 million really fueled that. and then collectively everybody ponied up and all the different resources came together. And the Navy really needed that. They were kind of limited. They didn't have wartime type diving and things, and so their skills were, waning. So it was a great opportunity then for them to kind of get back in the game, and very enthusiastic, about it. So it's kind of a side mission of theirs, but kept them trained up. Yeah,
Had the Monitor not sunk, but was being towed down to Beaufort,
right.
it was going to be some more from battle.
That's right. So it would have been there.
Had the cannon.
Yeah,
It was ready to go back into battle.
yeah. It was. Yeah, it was. The problem was it wasn't seaworthy for outside of coast. Sure. Yeah, it was going to be there and be positioned for either getting, fortifying ports and defense. Maybe it would have made its way down to Wilmington, off Fort Fisher or something. However, it was going to be deployed. So, and then of course, the Confederates, once they learned about the technology and after CSS Virginia, then there are multiple vessels that were converted ironclads, both on the southern side and the northern side. And there were other monitors that in development that were more, I wouldn't say they're much more sophisticated, but design changes and things like that. But I can't remember the count, but there were a lot more vessels that spawned. What's that? They were, yep. They had different, kind of characteristics, or they might have another sub name, but the idea was it was a coastal defense, warfare type tool in that capacity. Yeah.
Is the lack of funding the only thing keeping the rest of it down on the bottom, or
The ship was so badly
is there anything else that you would like to bring up?
I mean, it would be great if you could continue to dive and support, because think about all the personal effects and all the other things from that time period. So things that you find are, the stuff that the crew would carry, and plates and silver and bottles and medicine bottles and houseware, and then arms.
Divers going down there doing
There's nothing. It's really from a collection and artifact. Nothing's really going there. They're just monitoring. Really, it's degradation in situ kind of a thing. So there's nothing that I know of that's going forward with mounting a kind of a diving expedition for artifacts. A lot of challenges because of all the way the ship is kind of caving in on itself, moving large steel plates. They have one on display, which is about the size of those doors, and they're huge, that were plated on the deck and on the sides around the armor belt, on the lower hull. It was in varying thicknesses. The turret was about 8 inches thick to repel the shot. Everything once it's under the waterline, there's not as much velocity. So but a wooden hull with ironclad. And
So at 8 inches, is that homogeneous? Or is that stacked plates?
stacked, yeah.
Excuse me, how fast would the turret rotate?
Slowly.
Slowly?
Yeah, I'd have to look back and the speed. So it was steam powered, but it wasn't something that, like you'd see on a classic battleship today. But the fact that they could go and turn it, 360 to position, but it turned slowly. So you were a little bit, unarmed.
Turn in one direction, correct?
What's that?
It only turned in one direction.
That's a good question. I'll have to look at that. It would make sense that it would go, rotate in.
If you were off, you wanted to go all the way back.
I mean, it had some capability to turn the vessel as well, but the idea was the gun would turn, not the vessel. Whereas like the CSS Virginia was somewhat hampered, had to get broadside for most of its effective guns. And then of course it was a little bit deeper draft, so it had trouble sometimes in shallow water. The Monitor has a little bit shallower draft, smaller vessel. But at one time, I think the CSS Virginia is the way the story got hung up on a bank. The Monitor, backed off for a while to regroup, and then, yeah.
Is there any evidence or idea, Doug, of where the remains of the other 14 crew buried in the sand?
Could be maybe in other areas of the ship they couldn't evacuate, maybe washed off the deck. So, yeah, I did a head count and they were missing. Why isn't it? Good question. Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, Ballard, when he found the Titanic, he didn't want anybody to touch it. And then slowly other groups came in and funding, and they started removing. They didn't remove human remains, but removing things. And there's a Titanic exhibits that go around. You can look at things that have been recovered. They're either off in the sand or some of the hull and different things. Your germ. If they were buried or in the sand, so the things for the two sailors in the turret, probably immediately after that sank, the coastal sands came in and deposited and preserved those. Because I was in the turret and I videoed, and I was in there. There's a full skeleton laying there, and two of them, and so carefully those were removed and were shipped off. There's a lot of controversy with your German U-boats and other countries claiming, admiralty rights, and they're sacred, and a lot of times we try not to disturb them. There's a lot of controversy if they're going in subs, and even in the Pacific theater, going in some of the Japanese wrecks and things like that. People still dive them, but they try not to remove things and do that. The Monitor's never really, for whatever, I don't know why it was never in that class. But the drive was really because of so many neat innovations and things, just to be able to have that and understand that, because it was really a unique vessel. It really set the tone for modern warfare. And it's interesting, there's a few pamphlets going around, gives you kind of the story, and I encourage you to visit the museum. And then if you do further reading and things, there's a lot of backstories about Erickson and controversy, and the Secretary of the Navy and Defense getting blown up by a cannon on the Princeton, and Erickson had a hard time navigating Washington and getting getting his permits and getting his money, and a lot of controversy surrounding that. There was another guy that did a patent suit. He claimed he invented the turret, so he sued Erickson because he used his turret on the battleship, and he said he invented it, which his name was Timby, and that was kind of interesting to look at that, but it kind of fizzled out. And Erickson didn't really care because he already knew about the turret. He didn't invent it, he didn't claim to invent it. But he just said, I'm going to put it on a vessel. I'm going to take it off the land, put it on a vessel, and make this what he called, in his renderings and drawing, this submarine type warfare system. So being low in the waterline, having the metal defense. But there's a lot of interesting bits and pieces surrounding, some of the acquisition, the building, some of the things that were occurring with the ironclad board and how they developed that. So those are featured in those different books. Yeah.
I grew up in Norfolk and went to the museum probably over a dozen times.
Yep.
Could you tell the group a little bit of the extensive collection of that museum beyond what you're talking about?
Yeah, so it's
massive.
It's a maritime museum. If you like wooden boats, they have a massive Chris Craft boat collection, wooden boats. They have a lot of ships models. They have a lot of artifacts and some things from various things and some military warfare type examples. A lot of different things that evolved in maritime history. So it's a well-established nautical maritime museum. Did anything else come to mind? And the Monitor is really one of their captive, because that was kind of being able to collect and be the depository for the Monitor was huge, even though it's not in North Carolina, but being in Virginia. But there's where you get your politics and your congressional people and money. But it was a great facility, and they do a really good job in the interpretation of that. It has a whole wing dedicated to the Monitor. But it's a great, place to explore. And
As a child, seeing all the models of sailing vessels,
yep.
was like seeing at that time period, the 40s, 50s, like seeing the development of history in 3D, what we can see now.
Yep.
In 3D when we see something visual, but to see the models is like seeing in real life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great way to examine. We were talking at dinner about, of course, the Hunley's a great visit and tour down in Charleston for the Confederate submarine. That's really an interesting story. I love that. And then off of Wilmington, the Pulaski which was a vessel, paddle wheel vessel that sank about 100 feet of water, about 40 miles offshore, came out of Savannah. It was the Titanic of the South, and there's models in Savannah, Georgia of that vessel in a small museum, and it's kind of neat to see that history and, uh, see those models. Yes. What's that?
Top speed of the monitor?
It was slow, 12 knots. It was, maybe 15. You saw the propeller. So at some stage in its deployment, it cracked 2 blades. That would have affected its efficiency. Where that is that coastal, shallows, a reef or whatever. It was a surprise. They never expected that till they pulled it out of the water. A couple fun, interesting stories if we have time. I mean, one was I was the last person to see the propeller in the water. It was 100 feet, and it was at night, and the photographer wanted me to go in and dive and document before it came out of the water. It was so dark, and I went in, we were 2 of us scuba, and it was so dark I couldn't even see the cable that ran down underwater. But they had attached some lift bags to give it some stability to take some of the load off bringing it up. And one of the lift bags had a little leak in it. And as I was swimming around and I saw these bubbles, and that led me and so we filmed it, lit it up with lights and things, and then it was kind of interesting to recover because it was nighttime and it's a little dicey here. And then we had an emergency situation. We would drop these 12 divers, and then they would ascend, and we'd send up a surface bag, and then we sent up a second surface bag, and then everybody on the boat knew that the team was together. The 12 we put in, we got 12 back. That was kind of the game. 12 in, 12 out, no discussion. 2 safety divers would go in and meet them and kind of help ride them up and monitor them. And we had a guy they called the sweat diver, and they would suit him up, and he was capable of going to the bottom. NOAA insisted on having all diving operations have some sort of a safety diver. So if the diver gets entangled or whatever on a military or commercial or technical dive, you have someone that can go in the water and rescue that person theoretically. And then we'd rotate, people go to the bottom, people go safety diving, and then the surface support and all that. So this particular day, it gives you a day out of the water. So I got suited up. And they call it the sweat diver because you're fully suited up. And for 25 minutes, you have to sit in a chair in the shade and wait and wait and wait. So divers go down. 25 minutes, okay. First bag comes up. Okay. We're waiting. There was no second bag. So what that means is that the team is not together. So we're missing somebody. We don't know who, what, where, when. Our support divers go in, and they report back that they have 11 divers out of the 12. Where's the 12th guy? Oh, shit. What do you think? Maybe he's on the wreck. Maybe he got entangled. Maybe he got disoriented. Maybe, oh, shit. So what happens? They say, safety diver, you dive. I'm probably the only person that ever dove the Monitor solo. So I had to go to the back of the boat. My knees were going like this. And I jumped in and I went solo to the Monitor. And in 10 minutes, I swam that entire wreck to rule out that this diver was not entrapped or entangled or unconscious or whatever. I shoot my bag, get up, the safety diver comes, support diver comes down, and we got 12. My heart's going like this because I'm running the operation. I'm the dive officer. The shit's gonna hit the fan if we lose somebody. Turns out, long story short, he was a photographer. We always go in buddy teams. 2 of us. So 12, you have 6 teams. So you're responsible for your buddy. So if you have to abort the dive, you abort, no big deal. But you stay with your buddy. That's the rule of diving, your buddymanship. He got in, was fumbling with his camera, and his buddy was kind of new to the project. And they get to the bottom, and it's kind of everybody's kind of doing their work. And this guy can't find the photographer, the buddy. So he goes over to another pair and he goes, "Can I buddy with you guys?" Instead of surfacing and signaling us that he lost his buddy, he stayed on the bottom. So the clock was running. So we did not know that the team wasn't functioning. The photographer couldn't work his camera. He decided to abort, and he came to the surface, but he didn't put any signaling device up. So he's drifting away. And we're both stationary on our dive team, 25 minutes elapse. And then 11 divers come up. That's when I went in. They got me. They found him. He finally had put up a signaling device. Everything, long story short, everything turned out well. But it was, it was kind of crazy. And I happened to be that was my number, lucky number that day. So, any other questions? I appreciate your attention. I hope
Doug, thank you so much.
great.